Imagine you have a sore throat. You go to the doctor who says it's nothing. But in fact, it isn't nothing, but a serious medical condition, and you end up losing your voice. If the doctor had spotted the red flag sooner, he would have referred you to a specialist, and your voice would have been saved. If you wanted to get compensation from the doctor, you'd probably go to some specialist lawyers. They would advise you on the case, conduct a litigation, and represent you in court if it went to trial. That's what I do. I'm a personal injury barrister. As a lawyer, you see things that most people never get to see. You're invited into the lives of people who have faced enormous adversity. You hear their stories firsthand, you visit them in their homes to see how they're coping and what they need, and you accompany them on their legal journey, often for years. And I wanted to share with you some lessons that I've learned from my experience in this field. There are some situations where the injured person could not have done anything to avoid the injury. This often happens in clinical negligence cases where the doctor or the hospital makes a blunder. If a surgeon leaves behind an instrument in the patient's abdomen, and yes, sadly, that still does happen, then there's little that the patient can do about it. Some of the saddest cases that personal injury lawyers deal with are those where the injuries could have been avoided or minimized if some simple precaution had been taken. In a recent case, a young woman was returning from a party in a car driven by a close friend of hers. There were 4 people in the car, and she was sitting at the back without a seatbelt. As her friend was driving, he fell asleep, and the car struck the vehicle in front at relatively low speed. The 3 occupants who were wearing a seatbelt escaped with minor injuries. My client, on the other hand, was unrestrained and so she was propelled upwards by the impact and hit her head against the roof of the car. This compressed and fractured her spine, rendering her tetraplegic. So she became paralyzed from the neck down, wheelchair dependent, and would need 24-hour care for the rest of her life. No amount of compensation is worth that. A single momentary lapse in judgment, not wearing her seatbelt when she got into the car, had in a flash changed the course of her life and that of her family's. The lesson here for all of us is to be aware of the risks of what we do and don't do, and of what would happen if those risks materialized. So always wear a seatbelt. Don't look at your phone when you're walking down the street. Don't jump in water if you don't know how deep it is. Don't walk alone at night in a dangerous area. And generally, be safety conscious and vigilant. And if one of your friends is about to do one of these things, then look out for them. If my client's friends had encouraged her to put on a seatbelt when she got into the car, things may have turned out very differently. 2 years ago, I represented the parents of a charming little boy called Armagan. He was 3 years old when one afternoon he started feeling unwell. He had a temperature and his heart rate was up. So he was taken by ambulance to the hospital where he was examined by a doctor who didn't seem particularly concerned. And so he was discharged that evening. But Armagan didn't get better. In fact, he deteriorated rapidly overnight. And very sadly, he died in the morning of an aggressive form of septicemia, which is a bacterial infection of the bloodstream. I'll never forget the consultation I had with the parents. The father was so devastated that understandably he wasn't really listening to what I was saying or what the other medical experts were saying around the table. At one point during the break, he showed me a video on his phone of Armagan the morning before he died. And it showed him playing happily in the living room of his house less than 24 hours before he passed away. And his father now cherished that memory. Since we don't know what the future holds, if death is waiting for us round the corner or in the distance, we too should learn to cherish those small moments of joy and not take them for granted. We should live life in the present, and this requires regular reminding because it's so easy to forget. And finally, I want to tell you about another quite incredible case. It starts in 1968 when my client, whom I'll call Ben, was just 13 years old. Doctors discovered that Ben was suffering from a condition called Klinefelter syndrome, which is when a man is born with an extra X chromosome. This usually results in a feminine appearance, weak muscles, infertility, low self-esteem, and behavioral problems. And the doctors decided not to tell Ben or his parents about the diagnosis because they thought at the time that it couldn't be treated. But they were wrong, because even in 1968, the condition was treatable with hormone replacement therapy. But Ben's doctors, who were not specialists in that condition, didn't know that. So Ben went through life unaware of his condition. He had a terrible time at school where he was viciously bullied, and he became depressed. He had low self-esteem. He didn't understand why he was different. He was beaten up by his father, who thought he was too effeminate. And over the next 50 years, several doctors noted that Ben had Klinefelters and that he had never been told the diagnosis, but for some reason, none of the doctors told him the truth. None of them referred him to a specialist in his condition, who would be a geneticist or an endocrinologist, so he never received the treatment that he needed. Ben eventually found out about his diagnosis accidentally, a couple of years ago, when he made an application to live in a council flat and he needed a copy of his medical records. Only then did he realize that the doctors had known about his condition since 1968. Soon after he found out, Ben received the hormone replacement therapy, and he's now a changed man. Whereas before he was depressed and despondent, he's now upbeat and confident. He has a girlfriend and seems very happy. What was remarkable about Ben, who's now in his 60s, is that even though he was let down by all these people, all these doctors over many decades, even though his life had been pretty miserable until now, he didn't dwell on the unhappiness of the past. He accepted the situation and moved on to enjoy the rest of his life. And I found his attitude inspiring. Sometimes there's no point in dwelling on past injustices and feeling sorry for yourself, because it just prolongs your suffering. Sometimes it's just better to look forwards rather than back. Having been involved in hundreds of cases, it's clear to me that many people who engage in litigation lose all sense of proportion. They become filled with hate and anger at what they perceive to be a huge injustice. It consumes them. That's all they think about. That's all they talk about. In some situations, they even become depressed. As a lawyer, I found that the clients who cope best with the pressures of litigation are those with Ben's forward-looking, pragmatic attitude to life. They don't get stuck in the past, reliving time and again the dreadful events that changed their life forever. Instead, they focus on the present and the future. And that, in my view, is much healthier. So those are just a few of the lessons that my clients have taught me. To recap, be conscious of the risks of what you do, and if possible, take precautions against them. Many accidents occur because people ignore the risks, underestimate them, or refuse to believe that it could ever happen to them. And younger people are particularly prone to this. Cherish even the small, seemingly insignificant moments of joy in your life, because you don't know how many more of those there will be. And finally, sometimes it's better to let go of grudges and bitterness about the past, and instead of looking back, to look onwards and upwards. Thank you.